The year is 1848, and New York murmurs outside in carriage wheels and iron shoes while the Astor mansion feels unnaturally quiet. Inside, behind drawn velvet and mahogany darker than the winter sky, John Jacob Astor lies at the end of a life that began in a butcher's cottage in Walldorf, Germany, and stretched into the largest fortune the young republic had ever seen. He crossed the Atlantic with flutes wrapped in cloth, mastered the fur trade, gambled on distant ports, and quietly built the soil that would become Manhattan's most valuable square miles. Now his breaths are thin, and his son William Backhouse Astor stands beside him, absorbing the weight of an empire that began with ambition rather than inheritance. Astor's final message is not poetic, it is a command. Make it grow. That charge will ignite the rise of a dynasty spanning New York streets, British titles, great houses, heiresses, scandals, and marriages that link America's first fortune to some of Europe's oldest bloodlines. In today's episode of Old Money Empires, we follow the Astor family from their German beginnings to the heights and pitfalls of becoming America's first old money dynasty. America's first multimillionaire, John Jacob Astor, entered the world in 1793 in Walldorf, a quiet German village where futures were usually inherited, not invented. His father cut meat for a living, his mother kept the household steady, and nothing in the rhythm of their days suggested that one child would rewrite the arc of his bloodline. But Astor had a restlessness that didn't fit the size of the place, and soon he was on the road to London, trading the sound of livestock for ship horns and crowded workshops. An uncle taught him to build and repair musical instruments, a craft that demanded patience, precision, and the ability to see value where others saw scraps. London also gave him English, connections, and a glimpse of how commerce moved when the world grew wider. In 1784, he boarded a ship for the United States with a handful of flutes and the kind of hope only a young man with nothing to fall back on allows himself. New York greeted him with unpaved streets and untapped potential, and he opened a modest fur shop that positioned him at the edge of a booming trade. When the Jay Treaty cleared the way for Americans to access British fur posts in Canada, Astor expanded aggressively, building a network that stretched from the Great Lakes to European buyers hungry for pelts. By the turn of the century, he was worth around $6 million, a figure that dwarfed nearly every fortune in a country still defining itself. He expanded into trade with China, moving furs in one direction and returning with tea and goods that filled the pockets of early American elites. Then he began buying Manhattan real estate, acquiring land at a time when most people still viewed the island as a patchwork of farms and scattered buildings. His brother Henry added an unexpected footnote to the story when he bought the stallion Messenger, whose bloodline would eventually dominate American harness racing. Astor's ambition pulled him west as well, and he financed Wilson Price Hunt's arduous expedition to the Columbia River, a journey that stumbled often, but still carved routes settlers would later use on what became the Oregon Trail. By the 1820s, Astor's fur enterprise operated like a continent-spanning machine, one of the largest businesses in the young republic. When he exited the company in 1834, fashion already moving away from heavy pelts, he did so with a portfolio anchored in Manhattan land that was about to become priceless. And when he died in 1848, his estate was valued around $20 million, equivalent to well over $100 billion today when measured against the size of the American economy. He left $400,000 for what became the Astor Library, a foundation stone of the New York Public Library. His eldest son, John Jr., struggled with health and emotional instability, inheriting only a managed allowance. The empire itself went to William Backhouse Astor, who now faced the weight of a fortune large enough to shape a city. And before we follow William into the world he remade, a small note for our most dedicated viewers: the stories that are too scandalous, too reputation-shaking, or too unfiltered for YouTube live in our free Substack, linked in the first line in the video description, waiting for those who want the entire truth beneath the polish. Next, we'll see how William Astor's instincts would redefine the family, starting with his quiet plan to turn land into power. William Backhouse Astor inherited more than a fortune when his father died in 1848. He inherited the responsibility of proving that American wealth could stretch beyond one remarkable generation. He watched his father build the fur empire brick by brick, or pelt by pelt, and understood that the next chapter of the family's story wouldn't be written in fur. It would be written in land. New York was still rough at the edges, a rising city rather than a finished one, but William sensed something in its grid and its geography that others ignored. He believed Manhattan was destined to become the commercial brain of the nation, and he wanted the Astor name woven into the island before the world realized what it was worth. He expanded the real estate purchases his father began, moving methodically, quietly, and with it that rivaled any modern long-term investor. Instead of chasing speculative ventures or indulging in luxuries, William built and acquired more than 700 houses and storefronts, embedding the family into the economic heartbeat of New York. His properties around the emerging Central Park proved especially shrewd, rising in value year after year as the park transformed a patch of contested land into the city's green crown. In an age without income tax, without inheritance tax, and without the regulatory hands that would later tame American fortunes, the rents flowed steadily and compounded freely. Wealth that had once seemed extraordinary under his father now grew into something structural, something lasting, something that made the Astors not just rich, but foundational. But William understood that money alone does not sustain a dynasty. Real influence requires alliances. On May 20th, 1880, he married Margaret Alida Rebecca Armstrong, a woman whose lineage ran deep into the political bloodstream of early America. Her father, John Armstrong Jr., had served as President James Madison's Secretary of War. Her mother descended from the Livingston family, a dynasty that had shaped colonial New York and produced founding father Robert R. Livingston, the man who administered the presidential oath to George Washington. Margaret brought legitimacy, history, and a bridge into circles money alone couldn't open. Their union produced children that would carry the Astor name into new realms, and the first to take the reins was John Jacob Astor III. Born in 1822, he possessed the steadiness of his father and the ambition of his grandfather, expanding the family fortune into the $75 to $100 million range, a sum that would place him among the giants of modern wealth if calculated against America's 19th century economy. He also initiated the English branch of the Astor family, a decision that would eventually carry the name into the British peerage and turn a German butcher's grandson into the ancestor of future viscounts. His sister, Laura Eugenia Astor, added another thread to the dynasty's web when she married Franklin Hughes Delano, linking the Astors to the family that would one day give the United States its longest-serving president. By mid-century, the Astors had become something rare in American life, a family with both vast material wealth and ancestry intertwined with the nation's early political architecture. Yet the transformation would not come from a boardroom or a marriage contract. It would come from a woman who understood that the true currency of the Gilded Age wasn't land or income. It was the ability to decide who counted. And her name was Caroline. When William Astor Jr. assumed his branch of the family fortune, he carried himself like a man who preferred balance sheets to ballrooms, but fate had paired him with a woman who saw society as terrain waiting to be shaped. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor entered the marriage with a pedigree that stretched deep into early New York, connecting her to the Dutch families who had occupied Manhattan long before it became a capital of money and spectacle. She had been raised in rooms where restraint was taught as a virtue, where manners were currency, and where lineage whispered louder than wealth. Her father, Abraham Schermerhorn, made his money in shipping, and her mother descended from the Van Cortlandt and White families, a heritage that gave Caroline the confidence of someone who believed her roots lay beyond criticism. In 1853, she married William and stepped into a world that was ready to expand, shift, and bend under the momentum of a new American century. A decade later, the couple commissioned a handsome brownstone at 355th Avenue, an address that would one day vanish behind the height and ambition of the Empire State Building. though no one at the time imagined the transformation. For many years, she lived quietly, attending to her home, raising her children, and enjoying the financial independence provided by her own inheritance, a luxury rare for women of the era. But as New York ballooned in size after the Civil War, the old social order began to fracture under the influx of industrial fortunes, transplants from across the country, and immigrants who altered the city's character block by block. The families who once held effortless control over Manhattan's drawing rooms suddenly found themselves competing with new fortunes that moved faster and pushed harder. Caroline stepped into this turbulence with the confidence of somebody who understood both the power of tradition and the need to wield it strategically. She aligned herself with Ward McAllister, a Southerner with an eye for etiquette and a talent for defining who belonged in the narrow corridor of privilege. Together, they curated a list that seemed to hold almost supernatural authority in Gilded Age New York. The 400, the number McAllister claimed could fit inside Mrs. Astor's ballroom. Acceptance became an event. Exclusion became a verdict. Her January balls became the unofficial state occasions of high society, where lineage, manners, and discretion mattered far more than the raw size of a bank account. Caroline's composure never faltered, and she navigated gossip the way seasoned diplomats navigate treaties, with calm detachment and a strict refusal to indulge in public emotion. Yet even she found herself at the center of a spectacle when customs officials seized a shipment of her gowns under suspicion of unpaid duties, prompting months of press frenzy over velvet, feathers, and a $300 fine. She emerged from the ordeal unshaken, and if anything, the episode only hardened the aura around her. The city itself had confirmed her status by attempting and failing to humble her. Her greatest challenge, however, arrived through a family whose fortune represented everything she believed money should never imitate: the Vanderbilts. She resisted them for years, dismissing railroad wealth as loud and inelegant, until Alva Vanderbilt staged a costume ball so dazzling that the absence of an invitation for young Carrie Astor became a diplomatic crisis. Caroline called on Alva, the invitation was extended, and the Vanderbilts were absorbed into the upper tier with a speed that signaled a shift in the balance of power. Her reign continued, but the edges of the world she had built were beginning to curl beneath forces far beyond her control. And soon the Astor legacy would shift from Fifth Avenue drawing rooms to a silent stretch of water in the North Atlantic, where tragedy would rewrite the family's place in history. When Caroline Schermerhorn Astor died in 1908, the ceremonial throne she had occupied for decades did not pass to a single successor because no one possessed her mixture of lineage, discipline, and quiet ruthlessness. Into the empty space stepped a trio of figures: Mamie Fish with her sardonic wit, Teresa Fair Ulrichs with her Western fortune, and Alva Belmont with her relentless ambition, each powerful in her own way, yet none able to command New York's social gravity the way that Caroline had. While they vied for influence, the Astor name migrated into the hands of a generation shaped less by ballrooms and more by a world tipping toward modernity. At the center of that shift was John Jacob Astor IV, the polished businessman whose interest ranged from real estate and invention to military service in the Spanish-American War, and whose fortune approached an extraordinary $87 million at the dawn of the 20th century. He carried himself for the knees of someone who understood that influence had become a public performance as much as a private inheritance. In 1912, he boarded the RMS Titanic with his young second wife, Madeline, expecting a comfortable return to New York after their stay abroad. The collision with an iceberg ended that expectation with cold finality. Reports later placed Astor on the deck, helping his pregnant wife into a lifeboat before stepping back to make space for others, his wealth and status powerless against a sea that recognized no hierarchy. His body was recovered days later, and with it a chapter of the American Astors seemed to close, the old world of inherited grandeur dissolving into a new century defined by forces wealth could not always control. But even as tragedy struck one branch, another was rising across the Atlantic, forging an identity that would endure long after Fifth Avenue mansions began to dim. William Walldorf Astor, grandson of the original patriarch, had already left New York in 1891 after a bitter rivalry with his aunt Caroline, an exile he transformed into opportunity. He embraced England with the conviction of someone who believed the old world still valued the things America had begun to discard: ceremony, lineage, and the slow accumulation of influence. By 1899, he had become a British citizen, and his fortune began reshaping historic estates, newspapers, and philanthropic ventures. During the First World War, his contributions earned him a barony in 1916, followed by elevation to Viscount Astor in 1917, cementing the family's arrival within the British aristocracy. His son Walldorf Astor and his daughter-in-law Nancy Langhorne, an American with a fluency for politics and performance, turned Cliveden into one of the most dynamic social and political crossroads in the United Kingdom, where statesmen, artists, and foreign dignitaries shaped the conversations of their age. By mid-century, a second title had joined the family's British portfolio when another branch descendant, John Jacob Astor, the influential newspaper baron, was created Baron Astor of Hever in 1956. With these elevations, the Astor story split into two hemispheres, one shaped by the fading architecture of old New York, the other by the polished rituals of Westminster. But titles alone could not guarantee permanence, and the forces gathering in the background, taxation, maintenance burdens, political shifts, and private scandals, are about to test the durability of a dynasty that once seemed immune to decline. And soon the world would see how the Astor legacy strained, adapted, fractured, and survived on both sides of the Atlantic. By the middle of the 20th century, the Astor name still carried the echo of a dynasty that once shaped both sides of the Atlantic, yet the machinery sustaining that prestige had begun to erode in places that earlier generations never imagined vulnerable. The American branch, once the unquestioned landlord of Manhattan, found its holdings gradually broken apart through sales, inheritance divisions, and the practical reality that a modern city no longer revolved around a handful of families as it once had. The British branch, despite its titles and its century-old estates, faced pressures of its own, because the cost of maintaining properties built for a different era pressed harder with every passing decade. Cliveden stood at the center of this new phase of the Astor story, both as a triumph and as a burden. When William Walldorf Astor purchased the estate in the 1890s and later gifted it to his son Walldorf Astor upon his marriage to Nancy Langhorne, he intended it as a stronghold of prestige rather than a symbol of responsibility. Under Nancy's direction, it became one of the great social engines of the early 20th century, a place where prime ministers argued over policy in the library, where Charlie Chaplin strolled the terraces, and where Winston Churchill traded quips under chandeliers imported from the continent. Cliveden absorbed not only politics but myth-making, and the rumors that swirled around the so-called Cliveden set during the 1930s created a cloud the Astors would spend decades dispelling. The estate also served as the backdrop for the Profumo affair, a scandal that shook the British government in 1963 and left the Astor family facing a level of public scrutiny few aristocratic houses had weathered in the modern age. By 1966, the family withdrew, handing Cliveden fully to the National Trust, ending an Astor residency that had once seemed immovable. Across the ocean, another chapter intertwined the Astor name with the oldest bloodlines in Europe through the marriage of Ava Alice Muriel Astor and Prince Serge Obolensky, a union that linked America's first great industrial dynasty to the Rurikid lineage that predated the Romanovs. Alice's inheritance, shaped by the tragic death of her father, the aforementioned John Jacob Astor IV on the Titanic, made her one of the wealthiest young women of the interwar years, and Serge's escape from the Russian Revolution brought a thread of royal exile into the family's tapestry of influence. Their son, Ivan Obolensky, embodied the crossing of two worlds, growing into publisher, financier, and a cultural figure who carried on the Astor instinct for reinvention without relying on the vast fortunes his ancestors once commanded. He became proof that legacy survives not only through land and titles, but through individuals who extended the story into new fields when the old ones fade. As the 20th century wore on, the Astor name settled into a quieter register, No longer the force that defined social boundaries, yet still woven into New York's foundations through streets, libraries, hotels, and neighborhoods shaped by decisions made generations earlier. Astor Place remains a crossroads of the city. The St. Regis still carries the imprint of John Jacob Astor IV, and the New York Public Library continues to honor the seed money that began as a line in a will written in 1848. Across the Atlantic, Viscount Astor and Baron Astor of Hever maintain the family's presence in British public life through the measured modesty of households accustomed to generational contraction rather than endless expansion. The Astor fortune no longer dominates headlines, yet the story never vanished, because the arc of the family reflects the full sweep of what old money truly means: ambition, ascent, reinvention, fracture, and endurance, measured not in dollars, but in the persistence of a name. And so the dynasty that began with a butcher's son in Walldorf still leaves its imprint on the two nations it's shaped, even as its wealth has thinned and its houses have passed into other hands. Now, we turn the conversation to you because your stories add texture to these histories, and many of you carry your own memories of the places the Astors left behind. And now we'd love to see you in the comments. Have you ever walked through Astor Place in New York, visited the modern St. Regis, or stepped inside the New York Public Library next to Bryant Park for all the New Yorkers? We look forward to hearing you in the comments. And as always, we appreciate your viewership here at Old Money Empires. And if you like this video, be sure to check out our Final Astors video, which goes even more in depth into the 21st century Astors that you've heard about today. We look forward to seeing you there or below in the comments. Thanks again, and cheers.